Do you suffer from chronic illness, anxiety, or sleep disorder? If so, CBD may be for you. This is Robert Manni, host of Guys TV, and this week my special guest is Martin A. Lee. Along with Reader's Digest, he's put together this essential guide to CBD. I've also got Charlie Z's. We're going to talk about sacred geometry and the power of pyramids, all on this week's Guys TV. You can also catch me on Guys Radio on KCAA in Southern California and my worldwide podcast, Guys TV, Guys Radio. Thanks for your support. Interview portion of our show now. We've got a terrific subject matter and a terrific guest. Our guest's name is Martin Lee. He's the co-founder and director of Project CBD, and that's what we're going to be talking about, cannabis. He's the author of Smoke Signals, History of Marijuana, and he's one of the 100 most influential people in the world of cannabis. And there's so much about cannabis that people don't really understand. And hopefully Martin is going to take us through, kind of give us a 101 and really introduce people to some of the miracles that CBD has been claimed to have been doing for people in terms of wellness and health and treating disease. So welcome to Guys Radio, Martin Lee.
Well, thanks very much. Pleasure to be with you.
Okay, I've neglected to say that Martin's kind of the behind this essential Reader's Digest guide, the essential guide to CBD, everything you need to know about what it helps, where to buy, and how to take it. And I read it over the weekend, and it's a terrific book because I didn't know a lot. I mean, I've used cannabis for fun a long time ago, but I did not realize all the possibilities that it has now. And I'm out here now in Southern California where it's legal and people think nothing about. I thought, oh, everybody's going to be smoking out here and everything. Nothing. I smelled more pot on the streets of New York City than in San Diego. And they have gummies, and it's just they've really cleaned up the quote unquote industry here. And then there's the other part of it, which is CBD. So let's start at the very beginning, Martin. What is CBD? What is THC? How do they work together? What is a cannabinoid?
Okay. Well, CBD stands for cannabidiol and THC, tetrahydrocannabinol.
Okay.
Those are two compounds that are present in the cannabis plant. Both of these compounds are actually approved by the FDA as medicines, as single molecules, as single compounds. But the cannabis plant isn't just one compound or two compounds, it's actually several hundred compounds. And all these compounds have been looked at by scientists and found to have, each of them, medicinal properties in and of themselves. But when you put them all together and you combine them, particularly CBD and THC, it forms a kind of a holistic entourage effect. That's how it's referred to in scientific papers. So that the therapeutic impact of the whole plant is greater than any single component in the plant. Now, that said, CBD has emerged in recent years as kind of a medical rock star. In and of itself, it is considered to have tremendous therapeutic value, particularly for little children with terrible epileptic conditions. It's been approved by the FDA for use in 3 different conditions. And these are, unfortunately, terrible situations where nothing else works for these kids. They're seizing 100 times a week. In some cases, CBD really does act as almost like a miracle cure that can either eliminate the seizures entirely or reduce them dramatically and improve the quality of life of these little children. That's not always the case, but sometimes, and that's why it has been approved as a pharmaceutical by the FDA.
Okay, let's talk about legality. I was amazed to see, I looked at the map in the book, and really there's only 2 states that don't have some form of cannabis legal, and that those 2 are Idaho and Nebraska, I believe. But every place else, it's pretty much for medicinal purposes at a bare minimum, whether it's how controlled that is or not. And it's pretty amazing. And it looks like that the whole country this will be a federal program at some point where cannabis will just be legal for medicinal purposes and probably for recreation also. What's your thoughts on that, Martin? Is it coming?
I think that's correct. I think that certainly the momentum is there. We are, as a society, as a culture, in the midst of a pro-cannabis shift, as it were. This has been happening for some time. In California, cannabis was legalized for therapeutic use in 1996. And that really set the ball rolling around the country. But I think when CBD appeared on the scene, which is about 2010, that's when Project CBD, our educational group, was formed. That ended up having a catalytic impact that it accelerated a trend, a tendency that was already active in the culture, and it really sped things up. And, by, I guess it was, I think, 2018, I'd say CBD emerged as almost like a mega global phenomenon. I think it was the most sought after supplement on the World Wide Web in terms of searches and so forth. So it really has hit the big time. But I think some have a tendency to want to separate or segregate CBD from the rest of the plant. And while CBD as an isolated pharmaceutical does have merit, it does have therapeutic value, the real magic is when it's part of the whole plant. And CBD and THC is the part that gets you high. CBD does not get you high. It's not intoxicating, and actually can temper the intoxicating effects of THC, can lessen it, or maybe even neutralize it outright. It's really the two of them working together, those compounds, that impart the most medical value. Cannabis has been described actually as a medicinal treasure trove. And you can think of CBD and THC as sort of the crown jewels of that treasure trove. But they're not the only compounds, but they're the ones that have been studied most, gotten the most attention, and that seem to have the most medical value.
So I guess what you're saying is the CBD on its own can work, but with a little bit of the THC, not so much that you're going to get high as you would get recreationally, but when they work together, it creates a greater sum. The sum is greater than the parts.
Yeah, it's a synergy essentially.
Okay.
These compounds synergize, and you can get in California if you actually any adult, anybody over 21 years of age, can walk into a licensed dispensary and can buy cannabis to smoke. They can buy gummies to eat, all kinds of things, including what we refer to as CBD-rich products, products that have a lot of CBD in it. And this might come in the form of what you just mentioned, where it's mainly CBD with just a tiny bit of THC. It might qualify in that regard as actually hemp. Or you might have variations of that, of certain products that have pretty much 50-50 CBD and THC, an equal amount. And those can be very effective. And incidentally, a product like that has been approved in over 24 countries around the world. It's called Sativex. It's a tincture. It's taken under the tongue. It has about half CBD, half THC, or about 49% each. There's a little bit extra in there. And it's gone through therapeutic trials, clinical trials, and it's been shown to be very effective for chronic pain. In some cases when opiates really don't do the trick. I mean, opiates are good for acute pain, but not for chronic pain that you have to take over and over again, the opiate. That's not a great pathway. You can get addicted and so forth. Okay. Well, this CBD THC formula has been shown to be very effective for chronic pain. Interestingly enough, the higher the dose, the less effective it becomes. So it has sort of the opposite effect of the idea that, well, if it helps a little bit, you take more, and it kills more pain. That's not really the way these cannabinoids work, the compounds in the cannabis plant. It's not that simple. So it requires a kind of education and understanding to really make the most of these things for therapeutic use. And we are in the midst of a grand experiment as a culture, as a country, as a planet, where we're rediscovering the medicinal value of the cannabis plant after having been cut off from a while as a result of prohibition going back federally to 1937. We are in the midst of changing that. And I agree with what you said. It seems we're moving in the direction of federal legalization at some point, maybe in the not too distant future.
Okay. My special guest on Guys Radio is Martin Lee. He is a writer and one of the co-founders of the CBD Project. And we're talking about the book, the Reader's Digest endorsed book, The Essential Guide to CBD. Let's just for context, where did cannabis come from? Was it originally from Mexico, and does it grow all over the world? Just for context.
At this point, it does grow all over the world. But when it started, if you go back in geological time, it seems that it appears first around the foothills of the Himalayan mountains in Tibet, India, that part of the world. The cannabis plant emerged as a distinct botanical species about 30 million years ago. But it has been a plant that seems to have ingratiated itself with humanity. Wherever it has traveled, on the trade routes, spice trading and so forth, cannabis was part of that because it was seen as a valuable plant. Wherever it has gone, once it left India, it has never been rejected in a place. It goes to another culture. It might become a point of controversy. But it's not like people decide, well, they tried it, they don't like it, they're going to have nothing to do with it. In a sense, you could say cannabis has conquered the world. It grows everywhere, probably except in maybe well, actually, I'm going to say in Greenland it doesn't grow, but you probably have some indoor grows. And in fact, I know you have indoor grows.
Well, originally, though, it came to the U.S. from Mexico, and then there were some problems where it was placed in a kind of category 1 most dangerous drug area, and for a long time, and that's kind of kept it down here. Is that correct, Martin?
Yeah, I mean, it came over first on the slave ships from Africa, actually, into South America and into Mexico, because it was considered a very valuable plant in different African cultures. They brought seeds of, the slaves brought seeds over, and that's how it came to North America. And it did get tangled into a socio-political situation where cannabis, or marijuana, as it was called later on, became associated with certain minority groups who were perceived during the Great Depression. These Latinos, Latin Americans, Mexican Americans, who were seen as, incorrectly actually, seen as taking jobs from white people. And it got caught up in a racist campaign. That's what we refer to as reefer madness, where literally the efforts to make marijuana illegal in the United States was brought about by a campaign emphasizing this idea that, well, if white women smoked marijuana, they'd want to have sex with black people. This sort of thing. It was really blatantly racist. Wow. We can kind of laugh at that these days. Unfortunately, it's sort of stuck with us. It's a stigma that has stuck. And in different time periods, it's acquired different alleged negative characteristics. Early on, marijuana wasn't said to be addictive. It was just said to be violence-inducing. Later on, it was said to be addictive. And they keep changing what's bad about it. But frankly, if there was something really, really negative about it in terms of health, I think we would have heard about it by now, because there's been so much attention given to cannabis. And a lot of money has been plowed into researching it to find something that harms. The great irony is, during the 1980s, when the Reagan presidency militarized, they relaunched the war on drugs, really with a vengeance, and placed marijuana as, enemy number 1. They poured money into researching how marijuana would hurt the brain, because they assumed, as drug warriors, that just was the case. The great irony.
Just the opposite.
Well, what they ended up doing is funding research that discovered how cannabis works in the brain. That discovered something referred to scientifically as the endocannabinoid system. And we can get into all the science behind it. But the point is, if you take cannabis or THC or CBD, it has effects for some reason. And the reason is it's interacting with the receptors, so-called, in the brain. And the discovery of what makes cannabis work turned out to be a huge discovery for medical science. But instead of showing that it harmed the brain, it showed that actually the compounds in cannabis could activate things in the brain which would actually protect the brain from degeneration, from dementia, and things like that. And this is understood to be scientifically the case. This is not controversial in scientific circles anymore, but the word hasn't totally got out in the general public.
Okay. A lot of folks, I was talking to a couple of guys the other day, and I mentioned I was going to do this show with you, and they were like, oh, I haven't toked in 30 years, and it used to make me uncompetitive and too introspective and all this stuff. And so I want to assuage all of those things. What are some of the myths? I think you just got into one, but what are some of the myths that people have about cannabis where they're just dead wrong?
Well, one of these ideas that it makes you lazy, that it makes you uninspired, to want to do things. So, Barack Obama was a pot smoker as a teenager. He became president of the United States. This is a myth. The problem is sometimes kids, particularly young males, who don't have a lot going and who watch too much television and don't get exercise, and they're not very inspired. And they sit around and then they smoke weed all day. That's not very good. Right. But why, is it the weed that's causing the laziness, or the laziness that's causing them to smoke the weed? Sometimes it's hard to parse it out. Now, one ongoing myth has been this idea that smoking marijuana can cause schizophrenia. And here again is a situation where what the latest science is showing is that the causality is actually just in the reverse. There is first of all, schizophrenia affects mainly young men in their 20s when you have a full-blown psychotic manifestation like that. It's a very serious illness. But there's a period, what's called the prodromal period, where a person doesn't show all the symptoms of schizophrenia, but it's starting subtly. And in that period of time, a person carries a lot of stress. They're a little bit disconnected from the flow, so to speak. And they're more likely than otherwise to reach for cannabis to calm them down. So yes, pre-schizophrenics do probably smoke more weed than the general population proportionally. But it's not that it's causing schizophrenia later on. It's that they're going through a process. And, we have to parse these things out very carefully and look at these things very carefully. I'm not a cheerleader for cannabis. I think it does have its downsides. It can be misused. Fortunately, it doesn't cause the kind of physiological damage that something like chronic alcoholism would. It doesn't, rot the liver and the kidneys and so forth. That doesn't mean that it has all positive effects, but it's not fatal. It can't kill you. You can't have an overdose. But what we need to do is learn how to use this properly and teach younger people how to use it responsibly, so they're not sitting around all day and using it as an excuse not to go out and get exercise.
Okay. Let's flip the script now. Let's get to some of the positives, and you've been masterful in answering those questions. Martin Lee is my special guest, co-founder of the CBD Project. We're talking about cannabis and some of the benefits of cannabis use for specific for wellness and for also specific maladies that people have. So let's get into some of the uses. What are some of the problems that people have, issues that people have where cannabis can be helpful?
Well, I know might sound a little outlandish, but there's very few diseases that it can't be of some help. Because the reason is because cannabis activates this physiological system called the endocannabinoid system. And when that system becomes dysfunctional, that's implicated in pretty much all diseases have a dysfunction of this system. So if you can give something to support this system, like CBD or cannabis, it can theoretically help a lot of different conditions. Now, in our culture, in the state of California, where the medical cannabis renaissance, you might say, started in the United States in earnest, or really it picked up, this is really where it happened first. Initially, it was people who are undergoing chemotherapy for cancer who were experiencing a lot of the side effects, the negative side effects, the terrible nausea, the pain, the neuropathy, and so forth. And they found, lo and behold, smoking a joint, took that nausea away in a flash, and whereas nothing else was helping. And so too with people with AIDS in California, going back to the 1980s, 1990s. People with AIDS go through a wasting syndrome. They lose hunger. They lose the desire to eat. They start losing weight. And again, it's a very serious condition, cachexia, it's called medically. And there are other diseases that wasting is part of it. Well, everybody knows you smoke a joint, you get hungry. It gives you the munchies. So if you're going through wasting syndrome, you're not going to feel like swallowing a pill or eating a gummy. You're not. That's not the way it's going to work for you. So you smoke a little weed and you get your appetite.
How about Alzheimer's and Parkinson's?
Well, these are neurological diseases, and they're very difficult diseases to deal with. There's a lot of interesting research going on trying to get at the root of what's going on with these diseases. But it's very clear from research that the U.S. government funded, and upon which they actually claimed the patent on the neuroprotective and antioxidant properties of CBD and THC, these key compounds in cannabis. The reason they took out they got this patent because they found in animal studies when scientists would create what's called disease models, they would create Alzheimer's in a mouse or Parkinson's in a mouse, and then they would give them THC or CBD, or they have two groups of mice, some of whom got the remedy and some of them didn't. Always the mice that got exposed to the CBD and THC did much better, and it either prevented the development of the disease or seemed to modify it and make it better. And on the basis of this research, the U.S. government now has a patent on this. So on the one hand, the federal government is saying these compounds have medical value. On the other hand, they're saying they're classified as Schedule I substances, illegal. that having no medical value and that are dangerous, which is frankly almost like saying the moon is made of green cheese. It's so out of touch with the reality. Everybody knows it. And it genders a kind of disrespect in society for the law. You know, when you see something like cannabis is so inappropriately treated under the law, people start thinking, well, all the laws are ridiculous and all the things that the government says should be ignored. And that's very unfortunate.
Right. You know, it's interesting that there's so many maladies that cannabis can conceivably work with. Let me throw another one at you, Martin. Um, ADHD,
Mm.
whether it's for kids or adults.
Yeah, there's been interesting research on that in Israel, which is one of actually the centers of cannabis. Some clinical trials with children with ADHD, and where the remedy is pure THC. And incidentally, that's not something I would recommend to people as a general rule. I mean, you can only get it as a pharmaceutical, but it's not unlike smoking a little weed. Pure THC is not a particularly pleasant experience. But anyway, what it showed this test with the kids is that THC was helpful for ADHD, and that's also something we were seeing in the culture where we'd hear reports from parents that Johnny, who was so yeah, uncomfortable at school and acting out and so forth and so on, he wasn't studying and this and that, and all of a sudden the teacher's getting back to, hey, what happened? He seems to be doing so much better. He's so much calmer. He's been turning in papers and getting an A, and the mother confronts the child. What's been going on? And lo and behold, the kid has been smoking weed, and it's been calming down. It's been actually making him function better. And of course, we're talking about not something in excess necessarily, but we
Right.
heard these anecdotal evidence
Okay.
examples time and time again. So
Um, Martin, how do people know what to buy? There's so much information out there, and there's a lot of bad product, I would assume. How can our listeners know if they want to explore this and do their research? How would you guide them?
Well, it is true what you say that the products that are available, it's difficult to parse out what's good and what's bad. CBD is not regulated by the FDA. According to the FDA, the only legal form of CBD is if you get it via prescription. Now, that's sort of a joke because it's all over the place. You can go down to the gas station down the street and buy something. It's not a place I'd recommend getting your CBD products. Um, in states where cannabis is legal, either for medical use or or for adult use, one has the option, if one is 21 or older, of going to a licensed dispensary, a licensed storefront, and buying a product that has had to go through significant testing. In California, any product sold in a cannabis dispensary has been tested for over 60 different pesticides and solvent residues and mold. There are allowable limits. They're supposed to be very, very minor limits, but anything over those limits, you're not allowed to sell it. So at least a person can feel somewhat confident that they're getting something that's safe. And also what's on the label of the product, what the label says, how much CBD is in there, how much THC, has to match the actual product. So part of the testing that one would go through in California or another state where cannabis is legal is to ensure that there is reliable. The 16 states now, I guess it is, that have legal cannabis, it's a little bit iffier. You can get CBD products over the internet, but you have to do some research. You have to, think it through because it's not always easy to know what's going on with the stuff because it is unregulated, and that's really the fault of the federal government. The FDA has a responsibility to regulate these things. They should. I'm for strong regulation on these products because, unfortunately, there's a money grab, and it's kind of
That's what
a
it usually
bit of a
usually
mess,
becomes.
which is not to say you
Yeah.
can get good quality products, but it does take some work. In the Reader's Digest guide, the essential guide to CBD, we have a bunch of material there, sort of giving a guidance to the reader if they want to explore this, sort of the do's and don'ts, how to get started. I think the book makes a valuable contribution in that sense.
Okay. Just in terms of how to take the product, I mean, we talked about some things that kids might have. Let's say you have a 10-year-old and he's got ADHD. You can't give him a joint or something. Is it a tincture? It's under the tongue? What's the way to and for old people too, like my mom